Hello and welcome. I'm Peter Dobby. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, China's Navy and its maritime militia, harassing fishermen and antagonizing its neighbors, or just defending their ancestral seas, as Beijing claims. Has the once dominant U.S. Navy lost control of the South China Sea? Also this week, Henry Ford may be best known for his car company, but he's also the man who gave the world the two-day weekend. But could the pandemic be ushering in the four-day working week? And environmental racism. Opposition grows to a pipeline that could put at risk the drinking water of black, low-income residents. In March, more than 200 Chinese fishing vessels occupied a reef in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Only the fishing vessels weren't manned by fishermen, but by Beijing's maritime militia, which have been deployed in the South China Sea to protect its, quote, ancestral seas. China claims the Whitsun Reef as its own. To the north, in the Spratly Islands, Beijing has built military installations and artificial islands. As China contests islands from Japan to Malaysia, the United States is deploying more warships to the region. Right now, in just the size of fleets, Washington has fallen behind. So this is what the picture looks like. China has 360 naval vessels compared to 298 for the United States. Beijing's maritime militia is estimated at 3,000 ships. These are not benign, but some are kitted out with lethal weapons and manned by ex-naval officers. But the United States has also the support of Australian, Japanese and Indian warships in this region. Even France and the UK are sending vessels to the region as well. That's one simple measure. So how much does China spend on its military? Well, the official number in 2019 was $183.5 billion, but it also funds the militia and various other security services, taking its total spending to an estimated $240 billion. This is still short of the $705 billion that Washington spends on its defense budget. And the total number comes to $934 billion when you take into account the budget for Homeland Security, the CIA, and other American agencies. So, with a more assertive China, the United States and the Philippines have restarted joint military exercises after last year's cancellation due to the pandemic. But the 50-plus year defense pact hangs in the balance because of the Philippines President, Rodrigo Duterte's initial decision to walk away from it. For Counting the Cost, Al Jazeera's Jamila Alingdogan has more now from Manila.
The U.S. Theodore Roosevelt strike group returns to the South China Sea for a second time this year. The U.S. 7th Fleet says the visit is part of its routine operations. But regional tensions are flaring because of China's reclamation of many areas and its use of maritime militia to enforce its illegal claims in the South China Sea. The U.S. considers the Philippines one of its strongest allies in the region, and these so-called Balikatan exercises allow both countries to conduct joint military and humanitarian exercises.
After its cancellation,
they resumed this week after being cancelled last year because of the pandemic, but they've been toned down. That's because Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte canceled the visiting forces agreement between the two countries early last year after a political ally was denied a U.S. visa. But faced with widespread criticism and mounting public pressure, Duterte announced in November he was suspending that decision for 6 months. Duterte has declared since he took office nearly 5 years ago that he wants an independent foreign policy that is free from America's influence. And his so-called pivot towards China policy is seen by many here as an attempt to appease the country, but had come under attack.
By letting Beijing demean and abuse our country, the president is only signaling that we are weak, that we will not stand up for ourselves and our interests.
Despite weeks of public outrage, Duterte has remained silent over the occupation of the Whitsun Reef in the South China Sea by hundreds of Chinese military vessels.
The arrival of China's maritime militia and fishing fleet at Whitsun Reef in my opinion, is designed to put pressure on Duterte, who equivocates on whether or not he's going to terminate the visiting forces agreement.
Last week, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin spoke with his counterpart in the Philippines, Secretary Delfin Lorenzana, to discuss the situation. Austin proposed measures to deepen defense cooperation, but many here believe this will prove difficult unless the visiting forces agreement is fully restored. Jamela Alindogen, Al Jazeera, Manila.
Right, let's get some analysis from Dr. Graham Ong-Webb. He's the adjunct fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. He joins us from Singapore. Graham, great to see you there again in Singapore. Give me your thoughts on the top line on this story. The United States says there's 3,000 ships in this region. What's your reading of that?
My reading is that this assessment by the United States Department of Defense essentially is an accurate one. There has been a quiet expansion of China's maritime militia over the last decade alone. This is not a new concept for the Chinese military, in particular the People's Liberation Army Navy, which feels this capability. It's a concerted attempt by the Chinese military to try and create a force multiplier of sorts over the wide expanse of the South China Sea.
Graham, can you explain for me one particular aspect of this, which is kind of intriguing and compelling, I guess, in equal measure? Officially, the militia isn't there to do what everyone else thinks the militia is there to do. Officially, at some levels, the militia doesn't even exist. But on the other hand, President Xi Jinping has spoken about it in public. So there's an acceptance of the reality, but there's a denial at the same time.
Therein lies the problem, because, yes, he has talked about it. The Central Military Commission, the CMC, which oversees China's military forces, both land, sea, and air, has also referred to this idea of a militia. It's a very established traditional concept for Chinese strategy in fielding guerrilla-type forces, traditionally on land, but now at sea. So there's no hiding about it. But I think there's still this element of plausible deniability, because push come to shove, these vessels operating at sea, fundamentally they're being operated by fishermen, albeit they have received some amount of training, from what we know, in being able to operate in sort of a paramilitary style, if you like. But if there's this element of plausible deniability, because they are also trained to jettison whatever small munitions that they may carry, the radio set which they use to communicate with conventional Chinese naval forces. They can throw that overboard as well, and so there's this ambiguity about it, which makes it a very wicked problem.
If it's a creative device, that seems to me as if it could potentially be quite sinister. So, key question for the United States: if you're a naval/military planner in the Pentagon, how much of a real threat are you thinking this militia might be?
It's a very difficult problem, because you really can't exchange physical shots. Even a shot across the bow can be very difficult, because in terms of the rules of the road, the established rules of the road, in dealing with armed vessels, we're talking about naval ships that sort of make up this arrangement. So maritime militia are not quite common. Now, of course, the Chinese have established this, and because of the efficacy of maritime militia, the ability to disrupt naval patrols, stand in the way, and hold a fort, if you like, before the mainstay conventional naval forces are able to be brought into theater. The Vietnamese have also followed suit. So there's a copycatting effect going on, where claimant states like Vietnam and down the road the Philippines, I'm very sure, will take up a very similar approach, sort of fighting fire with fire, because of the efficacy of maritime militia, the ambiguity, the inability for us to hold these forces accountable because of that plausible deniability.
Does this mean that for the United States, if there's copycatting going on the part of Vietnam and potentially in the future on the part of the Philippines, fold that together with the militia by definition being the kind of force perhaps that the United States didn't anticipate or didn't see coming, does that mean that China now in effect owns, runs the South China Sea in a way that the United States doesn't anymore and perhaps can never do in the future?
I think we have ended up in that situation where the Chinese essentially own that turf by virtue of that presence, not just the occupation of these islands or artificial features that have grown into islands, but also by the fact that a 3,000 strong maritime militia is casting the net far and wide for the Chinese Navy and for the Chinese military in general. That is exactly the kind of anti-access, anti-denial approach that the Chinese by design have been wanting to feel for a long time. Now, mind you, the Chinese defense budget is a third of the American defense budget. So the Chinese have to make their punches count. They are expanding their conventional naval forces. They are trying to field several aircraft carriers to operate in the South China Sea. But the maritime militia is a cheap and very effective instrument to plug the gap until the Chinese Navy, in particular, matures and becomes a force to be reckoned with.
Graham, thank you so much. We must leave it there. Graham Ong-Webb there talking to us from Singapore.
Thank you.
US politicians and activists are rallying against the construction of an oil pipeline in the US city of Memphis. Environmental activists say it puts at risk the drinking water of low-income residents, a majority of whom are black. The former Vice President, Al Gore, has called it a case of environmental racism. Manuel Rapallo reports.
For months, residents in South Memphis have been fighting against the construction of an oil pipeline. Al-Marie Dorsey says she's worried over what it might mean if a proposed oil pipeline were to cut right through the neighborhood she's lived in for most of her life.
My thought was, why would they bring it through my neighborhood?
There's a growing movement among the local population against the plans for the energy project. The concern from activists like Justin J. Pearson is over the route being proposed for the pipeline, which is expected to pass over the Memphis aquifer.
So one of the most severe negative consequences is to our environment. They're planning to build a 1,500 psi crude oil pipeline atop the Memphis sand aquifer, which supplies drinking water to over 1 million people. In addition to this, they're building it atop an area that's the most seismically active in the southeastern part of the United States.
The pipeline would also pass through Boxtown, a predominantly black neighborhood that critics say is already exposed to pollution from several nearby industrial sites. In recent weeks, a growing chorus of voices have spoken out against the project, including at least 28 members of Congress and former U.S. Vice President Al Gore.
It is reckless, racist, it is a ripoff. We're trying to stop this pipeline. It's called the Byhalia Pipeline. The Memphis mayor just came out against it 2 days ago, which gave us all some great encouragement. The two companies are trying to bully the city with threats of lawsuits. They do that everywhere, even though their legal theories are often nonsense. But Memphis is standing up because the black citizens of Memphis and their white allies are standing up to say no more of this environmental racism.
A controversial aspect of this pipeline and others like it across the United States is the use of nationwide Permit 12, which allows fossil fuel companies to fast-track projects like the Byhalia Connection Pipeline.
The parent company responsible for the project, Valero Energy Corporation, did not respond to our request for a comment, but the company has defended the project, promising the pipeline will meet environmental standards.
Almost a century ago, the 5-day working week was born after Henry Ford decided workers with more leisure time would buy more cars. He was right. Now, with many people flipping open their laptops and working from home during the pandemic, there is a desire for some not to return to 5 days in the office. Well, they may be in luck. A number of companies that have switched to a 4-day working week believe productivity and employee well-being has improved. And Spain is preparing to pilot a 32-hour working week sometime this coming autumn. That comes some 20-odd years since France capped its working week there at 35 hours. Let's get more on this initiative with Heejung Chung, a researcher on the labour market and director of the Welfare State Research Cluster at the University of Kent in the UK. Heejung, welcome back to Counting the Cost. Is this a fad, or is there a genuine momentum here that will introduce it and keep it, I guess, becoming part of the status quo of how we work?
I don't think this is a fad. I think after especially the pandemic, a lot of countries as well as companies are seeing the benefits of having shorter hours, not only because of the productivity issues that you've mentioned, but about worker retention, worker recruitment, as well as kind of addressing some of the societal costs of long hours work, such as mental health issues, burnout, etc. And increasingly, we are seeing movements from across the world to really get this movement at a national level even.
But capping the working week at 35 hours, as the legislation stands in France, is different to working from home. So this is being spun, I guess, by employers or by big companies as saying this is actually a good thing for employees' mental health. But sometimes a lot of people don't actually like working from home because it increases that feeling of isolation. It increases not having those water cooler moments, not interacting with people in the workplace and getting the dynamism and the synergy from actually having a face-to-face conversation.
Absolutely. One of the things I do want to point out, though, the 4-day week and working from home are two very different policies. Having said that, I think another reason why the 4-day week has become more popular is because as people work from home, the idea of working 40 hours in the office becomes obsolete. So it is more, in a way, easier to kind of get rid of the idea that working hours necessarily lead to productivity or commitment of workers and introduce working from home and 4-day week at the same time. About those isolation issues and having that collaboration with colleagues, etc., I definitely see the point in that the physical contact, being able to see each other, also kind of at a whim, maybe ad hocly, does have an influence on maybe collaboration or kind of these moments where you find ideas. But this doesn't necessarily mean that working from home should not be introduced. It's more about how do we then make, let's say, virtual water cooler spaces or virtual collaboration areas where people could actually really have time and kind of space to think about these issues as well? So, there are issues, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't introduce these policies.
Certain regions in Spain are going to be experimenting with this towards the end of this year, autumn time in Northern Europe. How do you judge, and how long does it take to judge whether this has been a success or not? Because if the companies are making more money, they would say, yes, it's a success. If we're spending less money or no money moving our staff around Spain, that's a win-win, but it might not be a win-win for the employees.
Well, I think it takes a while. It's not something that you could just kind of gather evidence and then make a decision in a couple of weeks' time. I think, especially given that going for a 4-day week is really entailing a huge disruption, or disrupting the way we think about productivity, our work processes, and the way we work. Now, that doesn't come just, in a day or two. That takes a long process where there has to be a lot of discussions between employers and employees. And that, I would say, I can't give you an exact date, but it would take months, if not a year, for those processes to really take place and be efficient enough for us to say, actually, this is the benefits. The other thing is that a lot of the benefits actually don't only come in through the productivity per hour, but actually in terms of reduction of sickness, retention, recruitment issues, where we are getting rid of, eliminating some of the costs of the existing work cultures that we live in. So those things take some time. And again, there might be some hesitations by even workers in introducing these 4-day weeks, although in general, we do see that there is more of an excitement than a hesitation. It will take a while for people to get used to it as well. And as people spend less time at work, they will start enjoying things outside of work in terms of spending time with family, spending time doing more proper leisure other than TV watching, which really will reap so much more benefits in terms of societal costs as well.
Heejung, do you think this will catch on around the world? We're well used to people like Jack Ma, the billionaire co-founder of that big e-commerce firm in China. He's a firm believer in the so-called 996 rule, isn't he? You work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, you rest on the 7th day. That's how he thinks you should make big money.
I think that approach is wrong. And we have, as a part of this very large kind of academic community that looks at working hours and this impact, not just on productivity, but also on the social cost. There's so many social costs that come with it. Well, to begin with, it's not very productive. Those very long hours end up resulting in lower productivity, and you even actually end up making mistakes to the point where it becomes negative productivity for most workers. I'm not saying all, but for most workers. Also, the long-term costs of that. So workers tend to burn out easily. They go into sickness and absenteeism, which is not disruptive only for the workers, but the whole work group or the company as a whole. There's huge implications in terms of the impact it has even on the partners and children. Children suffer emotionally, psychologically, even their cognitive development may be hindered if parents do not spend time with them. So I don't think that's necessarily a way to productivity. And again, we see so many evidence pointing to that direction. In fact, working shorter hours can be beneficial, again, for the individual, for the company, but as a society as a whole, especially when we think about the social costs of very long working hours. Again, it might be that in the very introduction, 4-day week may be a bit costly for certain companies where you do need to introduce more workforce to the company. But having said that, on the longer run, in terms of retention, recruitment, hourly productivity, but also ensuring that workers are not burnt out, workers are productive, not just for that day or that week, but for a long period of time, they do not move to other companies or leave the labor market altogether. These are the kind of the benefits we can see, and the benefits that impacts society in terms of societal well-being and welfare, in terms of reduction of health costs, can be really immense.
Heejung Chung, we'll have to leave it there. Great to talk to you here this week on Counting the Cost.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, the crew of a cargo ship abandoned in the Kenyan port of Mombasa have now been trapped on board for more than 18 months. They've not been paid for even longer, and they rely on handouts for food, clothing and medicine. Al Jazeera's Ong-Webb has been to visit them.
It's Moses Mooley's job to look after the crews of abandoned ships. He took us to one, the MV Jinan, that's moored off Kenya's coast. 1.5 years ago, it unloaded a cargo of construction materials here at the port of Mombasa. And it's been in this channel ever since, waiting for instructions from its Lebanese owners that the Syrian crew says never came. The only way to meet them is by climbing on board, since they can't leave the ship.
Assalamu alaikum. The situation that you've had here.
It's normal situation in the sea. It's normal. Many situations like this our ship.
Yeah. The ship's crew haven't been paid since months before it was abandoned. The port city of Mombasa is just there. It's only about 1 kilometre away, so close, but yet so far for the sailors stuck on board. COVID restrictions and immigration rules mean they can't go on the land. Plus, if they abandon the ship, they risk losing the wages that they're owed, in some cases up to 3 years. And so they're confined within the decks of the ship, which they say have come to feel like a prison. Fariz Sahwani, the ship's cook, sailed with it to Turkey, Romania and Russia before getting stranded here. He has a young child back home in Syria.
Nobody feels what I feel. I'm stuck here. I wish the owner could feel what we feel. If his children were here, he would know what we feel. I have been away from my family for 3 years.
They've been confined in these cabins as they wait for a resolution. And they're not alone. Around 6,000 seafarers face the same problem on hundreds of ships abandoned by their owners. The crew here has depended on food and water from a charity called Mission to Seafarers, brought regularly by Moses. He says ships' owners try to push abandoned crews to their limit.
They want to cause a crisis to the seafarer. They want the seafarers to get tired and leave the ship so that they don't pay the salary arrears. Some of the crew, their wives left them because life has to continue. I would like to term it as a modern slavery.
Abandoned cargoes can be a problem too. It was an abandoned ship's cargo that caused a devastating explosion in Lebanon's capital Beirut last year. The crew of MV Jinan hope their ordeal will soon be over A court in Mombasa ordered the ship to be sold in an auction. The owners didn't respond to our request for comment.
You stay for nothing, it's no good. But now with some light. Some light. Waiting order from the court, we take money.
We say our goodbyes and leave the crew waiting for whoever won the auction to pay up. And if that happens, they'll soon be leaving too and finally flying home. But thousands more like them around the world are still going nowhere. Malcolm Webb, Al Jazeera, Mombasa, Kenya.
And that's our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page with entire episodes for you to watch again whenever you want. I'm Peter Dobby from the Counting the Cost team here in Doha. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.